Imagine a world in which the sea belongs to something else. Not to the whale, not to the shark, not to any creature you have ever seen living or preserved behind museum glass. Imagine instead a world in which the largest predator on Earth breathes air and swims rivers and hunts beneath ocean swells, and has done so for so long that every coastal ecosystem, every reef, every estuarine delta, every open blue water hunting ground from pole to pole has been reorganized around its presence. Imagine a world in which the thing at the top of the marine food web is not a fish, not a mammal, not anything that evolved in the sea, but a dinosaur. A dinosaur that came down to the water's edge 100 million years ago and simply never left. That is the world we are going to explore tonight. It is a world that almost was. It is a world separated from the one we inherited by a handful of geological accidents, by the angle of a bolide impact and the direction of a pressure wave, and the look of which creatures happened to be standing where when the Cretaceous ended. Change those accidents, and the oceans of Earth might look something like what you are about to hear. Every coastline different, every migration corridor altered, every evolutionary pressure downstream of that one change reshuffled into something that would make our own biological world look like a mere sketch of what life is capable of. Spinosaurus aegyptiacus is, by most estimates, the longest predatory dinosaur we know of. Longer than Tyrannosaurus rex by a significant margin. Longer than Giganotosaurus. Longer, perhaps, than anything that ever walked on land. The fossil record has given us a creature that stretches to somewhere between 14 and 17 meters in length, depending on the specimen and the reconstruction, and that probably weighed somewhere in the range of 7 to 20 tons, a range that honest paleontologists will admit reflects genuine uncertainty rather than false precision. What is not uncertain, not anymore, is the direction that Spinosaurus was heading. The evidence from the last decade of research points unmistakably toward the water. Dense bones that reduce buoyancy. Short rear legs poorly suited for terrestrial pursuit. Nostrils positioned high on a long, narrow, conical snout. A tail with neural spines so elongated and laterally flattened that many researchers now believe it functioned as a sculling fin, propelling the animal through water the way a crocodile moves. Spinosaurus was not a land animal that occasionally visited the water. It was becoming something that the Mesozoic world had never quite seen. A truly aquatic giant. A dinosaurian apex predator of the sea. But it did not quite finish the journey. The asteroid arrived before the experiment could conclude. The Cretaceous ended, and Spinosaurus went with it, along with every other non-avian dinosaur on Earth. And the oceans were left to the creatures that had been wading in the margins. The early ancestors of whales and dolphins and great white sharks, who filled the spaces that the great reptiles vacated and built the marine world that we know today. So before we get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what we do here on this channel. And let me know in the comments where you are tuning in from tonight. I am always curious to see how far these stories travel. Now dim the lights if you have not already. Take a slow breath, and let the modern world fall away behind you. Because the ocean we are going to is older than anything you have ever swum in, and deeper than anything you can fully imagine. And the thing that rules it has not yet been given a name by any civilization. Because in this version of Earth, no civilization has yet arisen to name anything at all. To understand how Spinosaurus might have come to dominate every ocean on Earth, you have to first understand what it was, and what the Cretaceous world was, and what the conditions were that allowed a terrestrial predator to begin its slow transformation into something genuinely aquatic. This is not a story that begins with one dramatic leap into the sea. It is a story that begins with riverbanks, with shallow deltas, with the smell of warm, brackish water under a Cretaceous sun, with a predator that discovered, over generations beyond counting, that the water was where the food was. And food, in the end, is the engine that drives everything. The Cretaceous period, the geological epoch that stretched from approximately 145 million years ago to 66 million years ago, was a world radically different from our own. The continents were arranged differently. The Atlantic Ocean was younger and narrower. North America and Europe were separated by a shallow inland sea, the Western Interior Seaway, that split the North American continent from north to south and teemed with marine life of extraordinary diversity. Africa and South America had only recently begun their slow separation. The climate was warmer across the board, with sea surface temperatures in tropical regions that may have exceeded modern levels by several degrees. There were no permanent polar ice caps. Sea levels were higher than today, inundating vast areas of the continental shelves and creating broad, shallow epicontinental seas that connected ecosystems across what are now dry land masses. The region we know today as North Africa, where the most important Spinosaurus fossils have been found, was in the Cretaceous a very different kind of place. The Sahara did not exist, where the desert now stretches its billions of sand grains from coast to coast. There was, approximately 95 to 100 million years ago, a vast river delta system, a network of channels and floodplains and tidal marshes draining into the Tethys Sea, an ancient ocean that no longer exists in its original form. The formation that preserves the best Spinosaurus material, the Chem beds of southern Morocco and Algeria, was deposited in exactly this kind of environment, a place where river met sea, where fresh water and salt water mingled in the amber light of a Cretaceous afternoon, where the food was plentiful and varied and always moving. Spinosaurus lived here, in the channels and the estuaries and the margins of the Tethys, and what it ate, primarily, was fish, not small fish. Fish that would dwarf anything swimming in any river on Earth today. The Chem fauna included Onchopristis, a sawfish with a rostrum, a long tooth-studded snout, stretching over 2 meters in length, a creature that was itself a formidable and dangerous animal. It included enormous coelacanths and giant lungfish, and polypterid fish of a size that would stop you cold if you encountered one in the wild. The rivers of the Cretaceous Chem were not gentle waterways. They were corridors of biological violence, rich with prey large enough to feed a 17-meter predator without that predator needing to go looking for terrestrial game. This is the first piece of the puzzle. Spinosaurus did not need to hunt on land because the water provided everything. And the more completely it committed to the aquatic environment, the more efficiently it could exploit resources that no other large predator of equivalent size could access. The niche was open. The food was there. The transition was underway. Now, imagine that the asteroid never arrives. Imagine that the Chicxulub impactor, that bolide approximately 10 to 15 kilometers across, that struck the shallow waters of what is now the Yucatan Peninsula 66 million years ago, misses. It passes through the inner solar system and continues outward, pulled by gravitational perturbations into a different trajectory, gone from the Earth's future forever. The Cretaceous does not end. Not that day. Not with fire and darkness and the collapse of the food web that wiped out 3/4 of all species on Earth. The world keeps turning, and the creatures living in it keep living, and the evolutionary pressures that had been shaping Spinosaurus and its relatives for millions of years continue to operate without interruption. What happens next is not a dramatic transformation. Evolution does not work in dramatic transformations, except occasionally at the margins, under conditions of extreme stress or radical ecological opportunity. What happens is the slow accumulation of change, generation by generation, each small shift reinforcing the last, each population that is slightly better adapted to aquatic life, leaving slightly more offspring than the population that is slightly less adapted. Over hundreds of thousands of years, over millions of years, over tens of millions of years, the changes compound, the direction clarifies, and something that began as a wading fissure in the delta country of ancient North Africa becomes, over time, something that the Cretaceous world had not yet finished building. Let us follow that trajectory. Let us follow Spinosaurus and its descendants as they move, over geological time, from the river mouths of the Tethys into the shallow margins of the sea, and from the shallow margins into open water, and from open water into the deep, and from the deep into every ocean on Earth. The first transition is the one that had already begun, from the river to the estuary to the coastal shelf. The early Spinosaurids, those first generations of descendants living in the world where the asteroid missed, are still recognizably related to the animal we know from the chem beds. They are long-snouted, fish-eating, dense-boned. Their tails are already laterally compressed, already functioning as sculling organs in the water. Their forelimbs are still large and strong, capable of gripping large prey. Their hind limbs are reduced, not vestigial, but clearly less important than they were in their fully terrestrial ancestors. They hunt in the coastal waters of the Tethys, following the fish schools that move in seasonal pulses along the shoreline, diving when prey goes deeper, hauling out onto sandbanks and mudflats to rest in the way that modern crocodilians do, their bodies catching the warmth of a Cretaceous sun. There is something very particular about this early coastal life that you should hold in your mind as you follow this story forward. These early aquatic Spinosaurids are not yet fully committed to the ocean. They still haul out. They still have functional limbs capable of moving on land. They can lay eggs on beaches, buried in warm sand, the way sea turtles do. They have not yet crossed the threshold into obligate aquatic life, but they are close. And the ocean, in this version of Earth where the Cretaceous simply continues, is an enormous and beckoning space full of prey that is largely unexploited by anything of their size. Because here is something that the Cretaceous marine world did not have in abundance. A warm-blooded, air-breathing, surface-breathing apex predator capable of sustained pursuit hunting across open water. The great marine reptiles of the Cretaceous, the mosasaurs and plesiosaurs and ichthyosaurs, had filled that role in various ways and with varying degrees of success. But they had evolved their aquatic adaptations along entirely different lines, with different body plans, different hunting strategies, different physiological constraints. The Spinosaurid body plan, that long, powerful, flexible torso with the enormous tail, and the mobile forelimbs, and the precision instrument jaws, offered a different solution to the same problem. And in the absence of the extinction event that ended the Cretaceous, that solution had time to develop. The Tethys Sea is the first ocean Spinosaurus inherits. It is a wide, warm, shallow body of water, stretching from what will eventually become the Mediterranean basin eastward, through what will become the Middle East, and into the margins of what will eventually be the Indian subcontinent. Its shallow shelves are rich with life. Ammonites, those coiled cephalopods that were the squid of the Cretaceous, drift in vast spiraling schools through the sunlit upper water column. Mosasaurs, some of them enormous, hunt along the reef margins. Large bony fish pursue smaller fish in the kind of predator-prey cascade that still organizes every ocean ecosystem on Earth. And the early Spinosaurid descendants of our ancestral Spinosaurus move into the system and begin to learn it. They are, at first, coastal specialists. Their hunting is concentrated in the zones where the seafloor is still close enough to the surface that they can orient themselves, where the water is warm enough for their still imperfect thermoregulation, where the density of prey is highest. They take fish, they take ammonites when they can catch them, plucking the coiled creatures from the water with those long, conical teeth in a movement that looks something like the way a modern grizzly bear catches salmon. That swift, precise, downward strike. They probably take the juveniles of other marine reptiles when the opportunity presents. They are generalists of the near shore, opportunists in a world full of opportunity. But generalists in a rich environment produce specialists over time. Some populations move farther offshore. Some develop the ability to dive deeper, following the vertical migration of prey that sinks toward cooler, darker water during the day and rises toward the surface at night. Some populations begin to follow the large seasonal migrations of fish schools that move along predictable oceanic corridors, the ancient highways of the sea that are driven by temperature gradients and current systems, and the availability of the smaller prey that fish themselves are hunting. These populations, the ones that follow the open water, are the ones that begin the second great transition. The move into open ocean is physiologically demanding in ways that coastal life is not. Open water offers no landmarks, no orientation cues beyond the angle of the sun and the stars. Open water offers no place to haul out and rest. Open water is colder at depth, and the energy demands of sustained swimming are considerably higher than the energy demands of shallow water ambush hunting. But open water also offers something that the coastal zone cannot: scale. The open ocean is the largest habitat on Earth, then as now. The food resources available to a predator that can exploit the open water are vastly greater than anything available near the shore. And the competition from other predators is, at least initially, lower, because the open ocean is a harder environment to enter and survive in. The Spinosaurid lineage that makes this transition does so over millions of years. The changes are cumulative. The hind limbs shrink further, becoming steering fins rather than legs. A process that mirrors, though it does not replicate, what happened to the ancestors of whales. The forelimbs, which in the early lineage were still large and powerful, begin to change function. In some populations, they become shorter and more paddle-like, better suited for maneuvering in three-dimensional space than for grappling with prey on land. In others, they are retained in a more ancestral form, still useful for capturing large, struggling fish. The sail, that extraordinary structure of elongated neural spines that runs along the back of the original Spinosaurus, has a complicated fate. In some lineages, it is retained and perhaps elaborated, possibly functioning in thermoregulation, possibly in display, possibly in both. In others, it is reduced over time as the animal spends more of its life below the surface, where a large dorsal sail would create drag and complicate diving. What does not change is the skull. The long, low, conical-toothed jaws of the Spinosaurid lineage are extraordinarily effective for catching fish, and fish remain the primary prey throughout this transition. The jaw shape does not need to change because the prey does not change in kind, only in size and variety. The teeth, interlocking and conical, suited for gripping slippery prey rather than cutting through bone in the way that tyrannosaur teeth do, remain effective against every fish that the changing oceans produce. And the oceans produce increasingly large fish over the millions of years of the continued Cretaceous. Because without the extinction event, the teleos fish radiation, that explosive diversification of bony fish that in our world happened largely in the Paleocene and Eocene after the dinosaurs disappeared, never gets the clear ecological space it needed. Instead, the fish lineages of the Cretaceous have more time and more complex predator pressure, and they diversify in a different direction, producing prey animals of greater and greater size, which in turn exerts selective pressure on the Spinosaurid lineage to grow, to become more capable, to push further into the water. Because this is the deep logic of the ocean. Size matters in a way that it does not on land, or at least does not in the same way. On land, a large predator eventually runs into the limits of the prey base, the carrying capacity of the ecosystem, the energetic cost of moving bulk across the surface. In the ocean, size confers advantages that compound with scale. A larger body retains heat more efficiently, which matters for an air-breathing reptile operating in the open sea where water temperatures drop away from the tropics. A larger body can sustain longer dives, can reach deeper water, can access prey that smaller predators cannot. A larger body can undertake longer migrations, following prey across oceanic basins in the way that modern sperm whales cross entire ocean systems in pursuit of deep water squid. And a larger body is, in many parts of the ocean, simply safer, because fewer things can attack you when you're the largest animal in the ecosystem. So over tens of millions of years, the Spinosaurid lineage grows. Not every lineage, not in every environment. The coastal specialists remain relatively modest in size, better adapted for maneuverability in shallow water than for the raw bulk of the open ocean hunters. But the deep water lineages, the ones that have committed most fully to the open ocean, trend toward larger body sizes over geological time, in the same way that whale evolution in our world trended toward larger body sizes once whales entered the open ocean and committed to a life of filter feeding or pursuit diving that rewarded mass. By the time we are 40 million years past the Cretaceous-Paleogene boundary, in this alternate world where that boundary never happened, the Spinosaurid family has diversified into something more like a dynasty. The coastal forms still exist, smaller and more agile, exploiting the rich nearshore environments of the world's continental shelves. But the open ocean lineages have become something genuinely extraordinary. The largest of them, the descendants of those early Tethys wanderers who first crossed into deep water, are perhaps 20 to 25 meters in length. They have a body plan that would be recognizable as Spinosaurid to anyone familiar with the Cretaceous fossil record. But they have also been remade by tens of millions of years of oceanic selection. The legs are gone, replaced by broad paddle-like flippers that retain the bone structure of the ancestral limb, but function like the flippers of a plesiosaur or a modern sea lion. The tail has become fully fluked in some lineages, the neural spines reduced, and the musculature reorganized to produce the lateral, powerful sweeping stroke of a large marine predator. The nostrils have migrated even further back on the skull, making surfacing to breathe more efficient. They still breathe air. This never changes. You cannot evolve a new gas exchange system in the time we are considering. The Spinosaurid lung, that efficient avian-style flow-through system that the dinosaurs inherited from their Archosaurian ancestors, continues to be the engine of their physiology. They breathe air at the surface in deep, efficient inhalations, then dive, and the density of their bones and the flexibility of their rib cages allow them to descend to depths that would crush the ribcage of a mammal not specially adapted for deep diving. They can hold their breath, these great descendants, for periods we can only estimate, perhaps 30 to 40 minutes in the deepest divers, perhaps longer, because the avian respiratory system is extraordinarily efficient at extracting oxygen, and the Spinosaurid metabolism, already running cooler than a mammal's by virtue of its reptilian ancestry, can modulate its energy expenditure in ways that extend breath hold time considerably. They are, in a word, impressive. The kind of animal that, if you were floating on the surface of a Paleocene sea in this alternate world, and one surface nearby, would make the hairs on your arms stand straight up, if you had hairs and arms, which in this world you probably do not yet. Because this is the other consequence of the world we are building. In a world where Spinosaurus and its descendants dominate the oceans, and where the non-avian dinosaurs never go extinct, the mammals that in our world eventually produced every whale and dolphin and seal and sea lion and manatee and otter that has ever lived, those mammals, in this alternate world, face a very different set of evolutionary pressures. They are not extinct. The asteroid's absence does not mean that the small, shrew-like mammals of the Cretaceous disappear. They survive, as they were already surviving in the shadow of the dinosaurs for more than 100 million years. But they do not get the ecological opening that the end Cretaceous extinction provided. They do not get the empty continent, the cleared coastline, the vacated marine niche that in our world allowed Pakicetus and its descendants to waddle into the shallows and begin the 50 million year journey to the blue whale. The sea is already taken. The coastal zones are held by the Spinosaurid descendants and by the surviving mosasaurs, which in this alternate world also persist. though they find themselves in increasing competition with the increasingly capable Spinosaurid lineage. The mammals of this world remain, for the most part, small and terrestrial and nocturnal, exploiting the ecological spaces that the dinosaurs leave them, the insect-rich forest understory, the seed and fruit resources of the canopy, the rocky crevices and underground burrows that large reptiles cannot enter. A few mammalian lineages do eventually attempt the aquatic transition, as the evolutionary logic of rich coastal resources is hard to resist regardless of which world you are living in. But they find the coastal zone occupied by animals that are larger, faster in the water, and already adapted to exactly the prey base that the would-be aquatic mammal is trying to exploit. If you like the video so far, please leave us a like and a sub. A sub to the channel helps us make more videos for you to watch and keep the channel alive. Most of these attempts fail. A few produce small, otter-like creatures that persist in the freshwater systems where the Spinosaurid lineage has a less complete grip. But the open ocean, the continental shelves, the estuaries and river mouths, all of these remain the domain of the dinosaurs. The implications of this ripple outward across every other ecosystem on Earth. On land, the non-avian dinosaurs continue to diversify. The titanosaur sauropods, those enormous long-necked herbivores that in our world were already declining by the end of the Cretaceous, find themselves with continued time and ecological space in the surviving world, and they do not disappear. The hadrosaurs, the ceratopsians, the ankylosaurs, all of these persist and diversify further. The large theropod predators, the tyrannosaurs and the abelisaurids, and the carcharodontosaurids continue their own evolutionary trajectories on the land. The world's terrestrial ecosystems are still dinosaur organized, still structured around the predator-prey dynamics of the great Cretaceous lineages, with mammals filling the small-bodied niches in the undergrowth, and birds, the avian dinosaurs, filling the aerial niches as they have been doing since the early Cretaceous. But it is the ocean where the most dramatic divergence from our world becomes visible, and it is the ocean where the story of Spinosaurus and its descendants becomes, over geological time, something that reshapes the physical world itself. Here is something that most people do not think about when they imagine large predators dominating an ecosystem. Large predators, at the top of the food web, do not just consume prey, they organize the ecosystem around their presence. They create what ecologists call a trophic cascade, a series of effects that ripple downward through the food web from the apex predator all the way to the primary producers at the bottom. Remove the apex predator, and the cascade runs in reverse. The prey species explode in population. The plants or plankton that feed the prey species are grazed down. The entire structure of the ecosystem reorganizes itself around the absence. This is what happened in our oceans when the great marine reptiles disappeared at the end of the Cretaceous, and what happened on land when the large predators disappeared from ecosystems across the world in the Pleistocene. The absence of the predator is itself an event. Now consider what happens when a spinosaurid apex predator of increasing size and capability is present in the global ocean, not for the brief span of a few million years, but for 60 or 70 or 80 million years of continued evolution. The trophic structure of the ocean is organized around its presence for all of that time. The fish that are the primary prey of the spinosaurids evolve in response to that predation pressure. Some lineages develop defensive schooling behaviors of extraordinary complexity, coordinated movements that make it harder for a large predator to isolate an individual. Some develop cryptic coloration, hiding in plain sight against the deep water or the seafloor. Some lineages develop extraordinary speed, racing for the surface when a spinosaurid approaches from below. All of these responses make the prey harder to catch, which in turn selects for ever more refined hunting capabilities in the spinosaurids, and the evolutionary arms race between predator and prey drives diversification in both directions simultaneously. The ammonites, those coiled cephalopods that had been declining in the later Cretaceous of our world find a very different fate in this alternate world. In our world, they were wiped out in the end Cretaceous extinction, leaving the ocean's cephalopod niche to be filled by the squids and octopuses and nautiluses that we know today. In this alternate world, the ammonites survive the Cretaceous because there is no mass extinction to end them. And the presence of large spinosaurid predators selects for ammonites that are harder to eat, meaning ammonites that are larger, that are faster, that develop shells with more complex structures capable of resisting the conical teeth of a spinosaurid jaw. Over tens of millions of years, the ammonites of this alternate world diversify into forms that we would not recognize from the Cretaceous fossil record. Some become genuinely large, reaching shell diameters of 1 meter or more. Some develop the ability to jet rapidly in reverse, using the same mantle muscle system that modern squid use for escape propulsion, but more powerfully and more efficiently. They become, in a sense, the great ocean wanderers of this alternate world, the pelagic prey that the Spinosaurid descendants are always hunting, and the evolutionary pressure of that hunt drives both lineages to become more capable, more complex, more interesting over time. The reef ecosystems of this alternate world are also reorganized. In our world, the end Cretaceous extinction reset the reef building community. The rudest bivalves that had dominated Cretaceous reefs were wiped out, and these scleractinian corals that had been present but not dominant in the Cretaceous eventually recovered and built the reef systems we know today. In this alternate world, the rudists survive. Some, exposed to the continued predation pressure of the coastal Spinosaurid populations, become larger and more heavily armored. The reefs they build are different from the reefs we know, denser, less structurally complex in some ways, but more massive, shaped by the different community of reef-associated organisms that evolve in their shadow. The fish that live in and around these alternate reefs are organized differently. The sharks, which in our world became the dominant reef predator after the extinction event, cleared the large marine reptiles, in this alternate world have a more complicated ecological role. They are still present. Sharks are extraordinarily resilient and have been present in the ocean since long before the Cretaceous, but they are not the apex predators of the reef ecosystem in the same way that they are in our world. The coastal Spinosaurids fill that role, and the sharks occupy the secondary predator niche, taking prey that is too small or too fast or too abundant for the large Spinosaurids to exploit efficiently. This matters, and it matters in a particular way that will shape the entire trajectory of life in this alternate world. Because sharks, in our world, are not just predators. They are also scavengers and ecosystem engineers, performing functions in the marine food web that keep the web stable and productive. In this alternate world, those functions are divided differently between the sharks and the Spinosaurids and the surviving mosasaur lineages and the other secondary predators that evolve to fill the spaces between the great apex hunters. The ocean is not less complex for having a different apex predator. It is complex in a different way, organized around different constraints, producing different solutions to the same fundamental challenges of predator and prey and competition and cooperation that govern all ecosystems everywhere. Let us now think about geography, because the world does not stand still while evolution is doing its work. The continents move. They have been moving since long before the Cretaceous, and they will continue moving in this alternate world just as they do in ours, because continental drift is driven by the internal heat of the planet, by the convection of the mantle, by forces that no biological event, no matter how transformative, can affect. The Atlantic Ocean, which was young and narrow in the Cretaceous, continues to widen. South America and Africa continue their slow separation. India continues its northward collision course with Asia, eventually closing the Tethys Sea entirely and raising the Himalayas in the slow crumple of continental collision. Australia continues its drift northward from Antarctica. The polar regions cool as the Antarctic continent settles over the South Pole, and becomes isolated from the warm ocean currents that had kept it temperate. All of this happens on its geological timetable, independent of which creatures are swimming in the sea. But the creatures swimming in the sea are not independent of it. The changing configuration of the continents reroutes ocean currents, which changes the distribution of heat and nutrients in the ocean, which changes where prey congregates and where the most productive hunting grounds are, which shapes the migration routes of the Spinosaurus descendants and the selective pressures that operate on those populations. The closing of the Tethys Sea is a particularly significant event. In our world, this closure happened over tens of millions of years, severing the connection between the ancestral Mediterranean and the Indian Ocean, isolating marine populations on either side of the new landmass, and producing differentiation between the lineages separated by the barrier. In this alternate world, the same closure happens on the same geological timetable, and the Spinosaurid populations on either side of the closing Tethys begin to diverge, the western populations moving increasingly into the widening Atlantic, the eastern populations becoming established in the Indian Ocean basin. These separated populations, evolving in isolation for millions of years, eventually become distinct lineages, and the diversity of the Spinosaurid dynasty expands accordingly. The Atlantic Ocean, as it widens over the tens of millions of years following the Cretaceous, becomes the primary arena for the evolutionary development of the open ocean Spinosaurid lineages. It is here, in the widening blue water between the separating continents, that the largest and most specialized of the Spinosaurid descendants evolve. The Atlantic, even in the Cretaceous, was already large enough to sustain populations of large marine predators. As it widens toward its modern configuration, it becomes a vast open ocean system, rich with the upwelling nutrients that the surface currents drive up from the deep, productive in the way that open ocean systems always are when the circulation is healthy. The Spinosaurid lineages that colonize this expanding basin have tens of millions of years to adapt to its specific conditions, and they do so in ways that make them increasingly distinct from their coastal relatives. By the time we reach a point in this alternate world's timeline that corresponds to something like our own present, approximately 66 million years after the Cretaceous did not end, the global ocean is organized around a dynasty of predators that would be unrecognizable to any marine biologist from our world, but that would be immediately comprehensible in its broad structure to any ecologist who understood what apex predators do. At the top of every major oceanic food web, in every ocean basin on Earth, there is a Spinosaurid descendant, adapted to its particular basin, its particular prey base, its particular depth range and temperature regime and seasonal migration pattern. These are not all the same animal. They have been diversifying for 66 million years, which is longer than the entire lineage of modern whales has existed in our world. They are a dynasty, the way the cetaceans are a dynasty in our ocean, diverse and complex and occupying a range of ecological niches that no single body plan could cover. The tropical Atlantic lineage is the largest. Possibly 25 meters or more in the biggest individuals, these animals are the true giants of the alternate ocean, the equivalent of the blue whale in our world, though organized around a very different physiology and a very different feeding strategy. They are pursuit predators, not filter feeders. They take large prey, the giant ammonites, and the enormous pelagic fish that the alternate ocean's evolutionary history has produced in long, sustained chases through the open water. Their bodies have been streamlined by 66 million years of selection for hydrodynamic efficiency. The sail has been largely reduced in this lineage, persisting only as a low dorsal ridge that stabilizes the animal in the water, the way the dorsal fin of a shark stabilizes the shark. The tail is powerful, the sweep of it lateral rather than the vertical movement of a dolphin's flukes, more like a very large crocodile or a shark in its movement. Because the Spinosaurid lineage never lost the fundamental body orientation of a terrestrial ancestor, and its musculature reorganized itself around the lateral undulation of the ancestral theropod torso, rather than the vertical flexion that characterizes the mammalian swimmers in our world. The temperate Atlantic lineages are smaller and faster, more maneuverable, adapted to the seasonal migrations of the schooling fish that move along the continental shelf margins in great silvery masses each spring and autumn. These are the coastal specialists of the alternate world's Atlantic. The ones that haul out on rocky shores occasionally, that have retained more of the ancestral limb structure in their foreflippers, that can move on land with an awkward seal-like locomotion when they need to, mostly to bask, to thermoregulate, to perhaps haul out briefly during the nesting season, because even after 66 million years of aquatic adaptation, the Spinosaurid lineage still lays eggs, and eggs need to be laid somewhere warm and dry, somewhere above the tide line, somewhere a clutch can develop in peace. This need for terrestrial egg laying is one of the great constraints on the fully aquatic Spinosaurid lineages. The one biological anchor, keeping them connected to the land even in their most ocean-adapted forms. Some lineages have solved this problem in different ways. Some have evolved ovoviviparity, retaining the egg inside the body until the young are ready to emerge, in the way that some modern snakes and lizards do. This removes the need to haul out entirely, freeing these lineages from any remaining dependence on terrestrial or littoral environments. These fully pelagic, live-bearing lineages are the ones that have pushed into the deepest and most remote oceanic environments. The mid-ocean gyres, the abyssal slopes, the equatorial upwelling zones where nutrients from the deep fuel explosive productivity at the surface. They are the true ocean nomads of this alternate world, circling the globe on the great oceanic conveyor belt of surface currents, following prey, following temperature, following the ancient logic of survival that drives everything that has ever lived in the sea. The Indian Ocean basin has its own distinct Spinosaurid fauna, descended from the eastern Tethys populations that were isolated by the collision of India with Asia. These lineages evolved in a basin that was, for much of its history, more enclosed than the Atlantic, bounded by landmasses to the north and west, warming toward the equatorial zone, rich with the complex upwelling systems that the monsoon-driven circulation produces. The Indian Ocean Spinosaurids are, in some respects, the most diverse of all the alternate world lineages, because the Indian Ocean is itself among the most ecologically complex of the world's ocean basins. With deep cold water zones to the south, warm tropical shallows to the north, monsoon-driven seasonal reversals of current direction that create entirely different oceanographic conditions in summer and winter. These Spinosaurid lineages adapted to this environment are correspondingly varied, from large deep water pursuit predators that follow the seasonal migration of prey across the basin, to small, agile coastal forms that exploit the mangrove systems and coral reefs of the northern Indian Ocean's shallow margins. The Pacific, in this alternate world as in ours, is the largest ocean basin on Earth. It is also the oldest, the deepest, and in many ways the most productive, because of the circulation systems that drive cold, nutrient-rich water to the surface along its eastern margins, the great upwelling zones off the coast of what is, in our world, South America and California. The Pacific Spinosaurid lineages descended partly from populations that crossed the western Tethys and colonized the ancient Pacific from the west, partly from populations that crossed through the shallow marine corridors that connected the Atlantic and Pacific in the early stages of the world's geological history. These populations have been evolving in relative isolation from the Atlantic and Indian Ocean lineages for the longest time, and they show the greatest divergence from the ancestral Spinosaurid body plan. The deep Pacific has produced some of the most extreme adaptations. The great cold water depths of the Pacific, extending in some places to nearly 11 kilometers below the surface, are beyond the reach of even the most committed Spinosaurid deep divers. But the mesopelagic zone, the layer between 200 and 1,000 meters, where daylight becomes dim and then dark, where the temperature drops sharply from the surface warmth and where a complex community of mid-water organisms makes its daily vertical migration, rising toward the surface at night to feed on the productive surface layer and sinking back to depth in the day. This zone is accessible to the larger Spinosaurid descendants, and they exploit it. The Pacific mesopelagic hunters have evolved large eyes, adapted to the dim blue light of the middle depths, and they hunt by diving from the sunlit surface waters down into the mesopelagic, in the way that sperm whales hunt squid in our ocean, making long breath-hold dives into the dark and cold to intercept the vertical migrants at depth. These are, in a word, remarkable animals. The fact that they are descended from a creature that was fishing the river channels of Cretaceous North Africa 100 million years ago, that the long conical teeth and the flexible jaws of Spinosaurus aegyptiacus have become the deep-diving, large-eyed, mesopelagic predators of the alternate Pacific, is the kind of evolutionary trajectory that reminds you that the history of life on Earth is a story of transformation so radical, so complete, so creative in its use of available material, that it sometimes seems impossible. And yet it happens. It happened with whales in our world, starting from a small, four-legged, terrestrial mammal in the forests of ancient Pakistan. It happened with penguins, starting from a flying seabird on an ancient Antarctic coast. Evolution, given time and pressure and opportunity, will go anywhere. It is worth pausing here in the middle of the alternate world's Pacific to think about what is not in this ocean. The great whales are not here. The dolphins, the orcas, the porpoises, none of these exist in this alternate world, because the mammals that produced them in our world never got the ecological opening that the end Cretaceous extinction provided. The sea turtles are here, or something like them, because sea turtles were already well established in the Cretaceous and survived its end in our world without issue. The sharks are here, because sharks survived the end Cretaceous extinction in our world, and would not have needed that event to persist. But the whole mammalian chapter of the ocean's evolutionary history, that 50 million year experiment that produced everything from the blue whale, to the sea otter, to the Weddell seal, that chapter was never written. The ocean mammals of our world are one of evolution's greatest stories, and in this alternate world, that story was never told, because the sea was already occupied when the mammals tried to enter it. What is in the ocean instead, besides the Spinosaurid dynasty, is a continuation of the lineages that were already present in the Cretaceous. The mosasaurs, which in our world were wiped out along with the non-avian dinosaurs, in this alternate world have continued their own evolutionary trajectory. They are present, but they are not the apex predators. The Spinosaurid dynasty outcompeted them over the long term, pushing them into secondary predator roles in many ecosystems, though some mosasaur lineages have found their own specialized niches in habitats that the Spinosaurids do not dominate. The deep, cold water lineages of mosasaur, adapted to the extreme conditions of the high-latitude deep ocean, persist where the Spinosaurids are less numerous. Some mosasaur lineages have become filter feeders, following a convergent evolutionary path toward the strategy that the baleen whales used in our world, straining enormous quantities of small prey from the water through specialized jaw structures. These filter-feeding mosasaurs are the alternate world's equivalent of the baleen whales, occupying the niche of large-scale plankton consumer that in our world is filled by the right whales and the blue whales and the bowhead whales that circle the polar seas in their annual migrations. The plesiosaurs, which were already declining in the late Cretaceous of our world, have a more complicated fate in this alternate world. Some lineages persist into the continued Cretaceous and beyond, finding niches in coastal and polar waters where they can continue to hunt the small fish and cephalopods that were always their primary prey. But the long-necked plesiosaurs, the elasmosaurids and their relatives with their serpentine necks, and their barrel bodies, and their four broad flippers, are eventually outcompeted in most environments by the more mobile and more capable Spinosaurid descendants. They linger in refugia, in the high polar seas and the freshwater systems that the fully marine Spinosaurids cannot access, but they are no longer the dominant large predators they were in the Middle Cretaceous. The pliosaurs, the short-necked, large-headed relatives of the plesiosaurs, were already declining at the very end of the Cretaceous, and in this alternate world they continue that decline and eventually disappear, replaced in the large aquatic predator niche by the Spinosaurids. The fish continue to diversify. The teleosts, the ray-finned bony fish that in our world became the most species-rich vertebrate group on Earth after the end Cretaceous extinction gave them space to radiate. If you like the video so far, please leave us a like and a sub. A sub to the channel helps us make more videos for you to watch and keep the channel alive. In this alternate world, diversify more slowly, but also more continuously, under the steady pressure of Spinosaurid predation that rewards every adaptation that makes a fish harder to catch. The result is a Paleocene and Eocene and Oligocene and Miocene fish fauna in this alternate world that is different from ours, not less diverse, perhaps more diverse in some families, but organized differently, with different winners and losers in the evolutionary race to survive in a world where the primary predator pressure comes from above, from a large, air-breathing, surface-oriented predator rather than from within the water column. There is something about this alternate world that is worth sitting with for a moment. In the dark of wherever you are right now, as the night deepens around you, what we have been building is not a monstrous world. It is not a world of unrelenting violence and terror, though it contains violence, as every world with predators must. It is a world of extraordinary complexity and beauty, organized differently from ours but governed by the same fundamental principles. The sun rises and sets over its oceans. The water cycles through evaporation and rainfall and river runoff, and deep ocean circulation as it does in our world. The seasons turn. The great current systems carry nutrients from the deep to the sunlit surface, and the surface blooms with microscopic life, and that life is eaten by small animals, and those animals are eaten by larger animals. And at the top of this pyramid, surfacing to breathe in the morning light of a Paleocene or Eocene or Miocene day in the alternate timeline, is a descendant of Spinosaurus, exhaling a long breath of mist into the cool air above a warm sea, and then diving again, vanishing below the surface with a slow sweep of its massive tail, going back down into the blue. There is something meditative about imagining this, about sitting with the reality that the world we know, the ocean we have mapped and sailed and fished and polluted and wondered at, is not the only version of the world that could have existed. It is one outcome of one improbable sequence of events, one configuration that happened to crystallize out of the vast possibility space of evolutionary history. The asteroid could have missed. The Spinosaurid experiment could have been given more time. And the ocean that would have resulted would have been in its own way as beautiful and as terrifying and as full of life as the one we know. But let us return to this alternate world one more time before we begin to let it go. Because there is one more dimension of it that we have not yet fully explored, and it is, in some ways, the most interesting of all. The question of what this world's apex ocean predator means for the land. Because the Spinosaurid dynasty did not completely abandon the land. Not all of it. Not all lineages. The coastal specialists, the ones that never fully committed to the open ocean, the ones that retained functional limbs and the ability to haul out on beaches and the need for terrestrial egg-laying, these lineages maintained a connection to the land that the fully pelagic open ocean Spinosaurids eventually lost. And that connection means that the coastlines of this alternate world are shaped by a very different kind of top predator than the coastlines of our world. In our world, the coastline is shaped partly by marine predators that come ashore, seals and sea lions and polar bears and sea otters and nesting seabirds, But none of these are the apex predators of the sea. The great whales do not come ashore. The great white sharks do not come ashore. The apex predators of our ocean stay in the ocean, and the coastline is a boundary they cannot cross. In this alternate world, the coastal Spinosaurid descendants can cross that boundary. Not efficiently, not gracefully, nothing like the full agility they show in the water, but they can move on land, and they can and do haul out on beaches, and mudflats and rocky shores, and anything living on those beaches that is smaller than they are, which is almost everything, must negotiate their presence. This means that the coastal terrestrial ecosystems of this alternate world are shaped by predation pressure from the sea in a way that has no equivalent in our world. The animals living near the coast must contend not only with the terrestrial predators of the land, the non-avian theropods, and the avian predators that have diversified in the continued Cretaceous, but also with the periodic incursions of large Spinosaurid descendants from the water. This predation pressure shapes the fauna of the coastal zone, selecting for animals that are either fast enough to escape, large enough to be unprofitable prey, cryptic enough to avoid notice, or smart enough to detect and avoid approaching danger. It makes the transition zone between land and sea a more dangerous and more ecologically interesting place than it is in our world. And it means that no large, slow-moving terrestrial animal can safely use the beach as a thoroughfare or a foraging ground without risk. There is a particular kind of ecological drama that happens in this alternate world at the meeting of the sea and the land. The coastal Spinosaurid descendants, hauled out in the early morning light, their bodies warming in the first sun after a cold night in the sea, are enormous and temporarily sluggish, and the terrestrial predators of the coast have learned to recognize this as opportunity. Small to medium-sized theropods probe the edges of the haul-out sites, looking for isolated individuals, for injured animals, for the young of the season that are still vulnerable. The Spinosaurids, for their part, are not helpless even on land. They can move, and a swipe of a tail that can propel a 20-meter animal through water at speed is not something a terrestrial theropod wants to be caught by. But the interaction between the two worlds, the marine and the terrestrial, played out on the thin strip of beach where one ends and the other begins, creates an ecological tension that has no precise equivalent anywhere in our world. It is, in the deepest sense, a reminder that nature finds every available boundary and makes it interesting. Every edge between habitat types is a place of contest and negotiation and evolutionary pressure. The edge between sea and land in this alternate world, guarded by the coastal Spinosaurid descendants and challenged by the terrestrial predators of the shore, is one of the most ecologically charged boundaries on Earth. To understand how dramatic a change the aquatic transition would have been, and how long it takes even under the most favorable evolutionary conditions, you have to think carefully about what the body of Spinosaurus was already doing in the Cretaceous, and what would have needed to change further. The starting point matters enormously. Not every lineage of large theropod dinosaur could have made this transition, not easily, not in any reasonable span of geological time. The tyrannosaurs, with their tiny forelimbs and their deep, bone-crushing jaws, were exquisitely adapted for a very specific style of terrestrial predation, and nothing about that adaptation pointed toward the water. The same is true of the Carcharodontosaurids, the enormous flesh-cutting theropods of the southern hemisphere, whose deep-bladed teeth were engineering solutions to the problem of slicing through the thick hides of large sauropods, not gripping slippery fish. These were land animals through and through, specialized for a terrestrial existence in ways that would have made any aquatic transition enormously costly in evolutionary terms. Spinosaurus was different. The Spinosaurid lineage had been trending toward the water, or at least toward the water side, for a long time before Spinosaurus itself appeared in the fossil record. The earliest Spinosaurids, those Jurassic and early Cretaceous relatives like Baryonyx, Walkeri, and Irritata challengeri, already showed the hallmarks of a fish-eating lifestyle. baryonyx, discovered in a clay pit in Surrey, England, in 1983 by an amateur fossil hunter named William Walker, and subsequently excavated by a team from the Natural History Museum of London, was found with the scales and partially digested bones of large fish inside its ribcage, along with the remains of a juvenile iguanodontid dinosaur. This was direct evidence, as direct as the fossil record gets, of a spinosaurid eating fish. The long, narrow snout of baryonyx, with its rounded cross-section and its many interlocking conical teeth, is not a structure that evolved for cutting through large terrestrial prey. It is a structure that evolved for catching fast, slippery animals in the water. So the fish-eating behavior was ancient in the Spinosaurid lineage. It predated Spinosaurus itself by tens of millions of years. And this matters, because it means that the aquatic transition, when it began in earnest with Spinosaurus, was not a sudden leap into an entirely new environment. It was the continuation of a long-running tendency toward the water, a tendency that had been building in the Spinosaurid family since at least the Jurassic. Spinosaurus was not the beginning of the story. It was a late chapter in a story that had already been running for a very long time. This is important for understanding the alternate world we are building, because it means that the evolutionary machinery for aquatic adaptation was not starting from scratch. The Spinosaurid lineage had already been under selection for fish-catching morphology for tens of millions of years when Spinosaurus appeared. The dense bones, the elevated nostrils, the laterally compressed tail, all of these were not innovations that needed to be invented from nothing. They were extensions of trends that were already well established in the lineage. The evolutionary work required to push the Spinosaurid body plan further into aquatic specialization, given more time after the Cretaceous, was the continuation of an existing trajectory, not the initiation of a new one. And continuing an existing trajectory is, in evolutionary terms, considerably easier than starting a new one. Think about what this means in practice. Every generation of Spinosaurid descendants in this alternate world is starting from a body plan that is already partially adapted for aquatic life. The dense bones that reduce buoyancy are already there. The conical teeth that grip slippery prey are already there. The flexibility of the torso that allows lateral undulation in water is already there, inherited from the ancient theropod body plan that all the Spinosaurids share. The evolutionary pressure needed to push these existing features further, to deepen the aquatic commitment, to refine the tail into a more efficient sculling organ, to reduce the hind limbs still further, to elevate the nostrils even more on the skull, is not the pressure needed to create these features from nothing. It is the pressure needed to fine-tune features that are already pointing in the right direction. This is why the aquatic transition of the Spinosaurid lineage, in the alternate world where it has time to complete, happens at a pace that is fast by geological standards. Not fast by human standards, not fast enough to observe in a human lifetime or even in the entire span of recorded human history, but fast compared to, say, the time required for the ancestors of whales to make their own aquatic transition starting from a fully terrestrial, four-legged mammal. The cetacean aquatic transition took approximately 15 to 20 million years from the first wading ancestors, the pachycetids and ambulocetids of the early Eocene, to the fully aquatic whales of the middle and late Eocene. Given that the Spinosaurid lineage was already further along the aquatic transition than the pachycetids were, and given that the Spinosaurid body plan offered certain specific advantages for an aquatic life, it is not unreasonable to imagine the Spinosaurid transition to full aquatic life taking a similar span of time, or perhaps somewhat less, perhaps 10 to 15 million years of sustained selection in the right environment. 10 to 15 million years after the Cretaceous that never ended, the world is already radically different from the one we know. The Spinosaurid descendants are already fully aquatic in the most committed lineages, already exploiting the coastal shelves and the open ocean margins, already leaving the terrestrial world behind for all but the most essential of biological functions. And the pace of change does not slow. Evolution does not reach a goal and stop. It continues to operate on every generation, in every environment, selecting for whatever works slightly better than what came before and against whatever works slightly less well. The fully aquatic spinosaurids of 10 million years post-Cretaceous are already becoming the ancestors of the open ocean specialists of 20 million years post-Cretaceous. And those are becoming the ancestors of the deep water lineages of 30 million years post-Cretaceous. And on it goes, always forward, always changing, always becoming. The mechanism driving this continuous change is the same mechanism that drives all evolutionary change, the inexorable interaction of genetic variation and natural selection operating across populations over time. In every generation of Spinosaurid descendants, there is variation. No two individuals are exactly alike. Some are slightly larger, some slightly smaller. Some have slightly denser bones, some slightly less dense. Some are slightly faster swimmers, some slightly slower. Some have slightly better vision underwater, some slightly worse. This variation is partly the result of a genetic mutation, the continuous low-level shuffling and occasional copying errors of the genetic material that is transmitted from parent to offspring. And partly it is the result of sexual recombination, the shuffling of existing genetic variants into new combinations in every generation. On most of this variation, natural selection acts quietly and invisibly, eliminating the combinations that work less well and passing on the combinations that work better. An individual Spinosaurid with slightly denser bones finds it marginally easier to maintain depth in the water column without active swimming, which costs energy, and so it is slightly more efficient in its hunting, which means it is slightly more likely to survive lean times and to raise offspring successfully. Over generations, the slightly denser bone variant spreads in the population because the individuals carrying it leave slightly more descendants. This is not a dramatic event. It is barely perceptible in any single generation. But over thousands of generations, over tens of thousands, over millions, it accumulates into something visible, into a population whose average bone density is measurably greater than it was 1 million years ago, whose aquatic capability is measurably greater, whose terrestrial capability is measurably less. Because the selective pressure for terrestrial performance is weaker than the selective pressure for aquatic performance in this lineage at this time. This is how the ocean gets built, not by one dramatic leap, not by one moment of transformation, but by the slow, patient, relentless accumulation of tiny advantages across millions of generations. The same process that produced the blue whale from a land mammal, the same process that produced the penguin from a flying seabird, the same process that produced every single adaptation in every single organism on Earth, from the first self-replicating molecule to the most complex creature alive today. Natural selection does not hurry. It does not need to. It has time. It has all the time there is. In the alternate world's Indian Ocean, a lineage of Spinosaurid descendants has by 40 million years post-Cretaceous developed an adaptation that is genuinely surprising, even within the context of the extraordinary evolutionary creativity that the Spinosaurid lineage has already demonstrated. These animals, living in the seasonally varying waters of the northern Indian Ocean, where the monsoon drives dramatic changes in temperature and productivity throughout the year, have developed a form of acoustic communication that is, in its structural complexity, comparable to the songs of modern humpback whales in our world. The sounds are different, lower in some registers and higher in others, produced by a vocal anatomy that is not the larynx of a mammal, but the specialized structures of an archosaur throat, adapted over millions of years for underwater sound production. But the function is the same: long-distance communication across ocean basins, mate attraction and assessment, territorial signaling across ranges too large for visual or olfactory communication to cover. The evolution of acoustic communication in these alternate Indian Ocean spinosaurids is driven by the same selective pressures that drove it in the cetaceans of our world. Acoustic signals travel farther through water than any other form of biological communication. A sound produced at the right frequency can propagate for thousands of kilometers in the deep sound channel, the SOFAR channel, a layer of the ocean at a depth of approximately 1,000 meters, where the speed of sound reaches a minimum due to the interaction of temperature and pressure, and where sound waves are trapped and channeled horizontally rather than dispersing upward and downward. Cetaceans in our world exploit this channel for their long-distance vocalizations. These Spinosaurid descendants in the alternate Indian Ocean, discovering the same acoustic physics by a completely different evolutionary path, exploit it too. The songs that result are extraordinary sounds, not the pure tonal signals of a humpback whale, though those are extraordinary enough on their own terms, but something more complex in structure, incorporating the harmonic series that the archosaur vocal anatomy produces, and the rhythmic patterning that reflects the particular neural architecture of the Spinosaurid brain, which is not the mammalian brain of the humpback, but is, after 66 million years of continued evolution, considerably more complex than the brain of the original Cretaceous Spinosaurus. These songs travel. They propagate through the SOFAR channel from the Arabian Sea to the Bay of Bengal, and from the northern Indian Ocean down toward the equatorial waters and beyond. They are heard, in the functional sense of being detected and responded to by other members of the same lineage, thousands of kilometers away, connecting populations across the width of an ocean in the way that humpback songs connect populations across the width of the Pacific in our world. No one in this alternate world is recording these songs. No one is listening to them with headphones and a research vessel and making notes about their structure and theorizing about their function. The alternate world has not yet produced a creature capable of doing that. But the songs exist. They move through the deep water of the Indian Ocean, complex and long-ranging and full of information that we can only speculate about. And the animals that hear them respond in ways that their evolutionary history has prepared them to respond. The alternation of ocean and silence and ocean again, the particular rhythmic signature of one individual's vocalization versus another's, the seasonal changes in song structure that may mark the approach of the breeding period. All of this is encoded in the sounds moving through the deep channel, and all of it is meaningful, in the specific sense that it influences the behavior of the animals receiving it in ways that affect their reproductive success. This is what the ocean sounds like in the alternate world, from the inside. Not silent, not the way the vacuum of space is silent, but filled with the vocalizations of creatures that have discovered the same acoustic physics that the whales of our world discovered, and are using them for the same fundamental purposes: connection and reproduction, and the maintenance of social bonds across the vast space of the open sea. The breeding grounds of the alternate Indian Ocean Spinosaurids are in the warm, shallow waters of the northern reaches of the basin, where the continental shelves of what are, in our world, India and Arabia and the Horn of Africa come together in a region of extraordinary biological productivity. Here, in the warm season when the monsoon-driven upwelling has seeded the surface with nutrients and the surface bloom is at its peak, the largest individuals of the northern Indian Ocean Spinosaurid lineage congregate. The journey to reach these grounds can take weeks. Some individuals travel from as far south as the equatorial upwelling zones, following the gradients of temperature and the cues of their long-distance acoustic signals. They arrive lean from the journey, their bodies carrying the reserves that the rich equatorial hunting grounds of the previous season have provided, and the first order of business is feeding, restoring the energy reserves that the long migration has depleted. The feeding aggregations that form in these productive northern waters are among the most dramatic ecological events of the alternate world's Indian Ocean. Hundreds of individuals, ranging from the young of recent years to the enormous breeding adults that may be 20 meters or more in the largest individuals, concentrated in a relatively small area of ocean, all pursuing the same dense concentrations of large fish and giant ammonites that the monsoon upwelling has produced. The interactions between individuals in these aggregations are complex and socially structured in ways that we can only reconstruct from the logic of similar aggregations in our world's marine predators. Dominance hierarchies based partly on size and partly on experience determine who gets access to the richest feeding areas. Younger animals learn from older ones, observing hunting strategies and prey detection behaviors that they are still refining. The acoustic signals that have been propagating across the basin for months converge here into a complex, multi-layered soundscape that represents something genuinely new in the history of life on Earth. If you like the video so far, please leave us a like and a sub. A sub to the channel helps us make more videos for you to watch and keep the channel alive. The eggs are laid on the beaches of the northern Indian Ocean, following a behavior pattern that has deep root in the Spinosaurid lineage. The need to deposit clutches in warm, dry environments above the tide line where the eggs can develop without flooding or drowning. The females that retain the ancestral egg-laying strategy haul out on beaches that have been used for this purpose for generations, beyond counting, navigating back to the same sites year after year in the way that sea turtles navigate to their birth beaches in our world. The eggs are covered, buried in the warm sand above the high tide mark, and then the females return to the sea, leaving the clutches to the warmth of the sun and the protection of the depth and concealment. The hatchlings, emerging after a development period that is probably longer than that of most reptiles on Earth today, because of the large size of the eggs, make their way to the sea immediately, running the gauntlet of beach predators in the way that sea turtle hatchlings do in our world. Most do not survive this journey. The ones that do reach the water and begin their aquatic life, small and vulnerable, but already carrying in their genome every adaptation that their lineage has accumulated over tens of millions of years of aquatic selection. The lineages that have evolved ovoviviparity, retaining the developing young inside the body until they are ready to be born into the water, have a very different relationship with the breeding season. They do not come ashore. They do not need beaches. They aggregate in the open water, and the births happen at the surface or just below it. The newborns immediately capable of swimming and breathing at the surface. These fully pelagic lineages have been freed from the last constraint that ties the egg-laying Spinosaurids to the land, and they have exploited that freedom to colonize oceanic habitats that the egg-laying lineages cannot access. The mid-ocean gyres and the remote equatorial upwelling zones, and the deep water margins far from any continental shelf. They are the most fully transformed of all the Spinosaurid descendants, the furthest from the ancestral Cretaceous animal that waded in the delta channels of ancient North Africa, and they are the ones that most fully realize the potential of the Spinosaurid body plan for aquatic life. The question of how exactly thermoregulation works in the fully aquatic Spinosaurid descendants is one of the most interesting physiological puzzles in the biology of this alternate world. The original Spinosaurus was, like all non-avian dinosaurs, a dinosaur, and the thermoregulatory physiology of dinosaurs was neither the strict ectothermy of a modern reptile, nor the strict endothermy of a modern bird or mammal. Most evidence suggests that the large dinosaurs occupied an intermediate position, running warmer than a crocodile and more actively than a lizard, but not burning the same metabolic fire as a mammal of similar size. The large body of Spinosaurus conferred considerable thermal inertia, the tendency of large bodies to resist rapid temperature changes because of the ratio of volume to surface area. The same principle that makes an ocean warm up and cool down more slowly than a lake or a puddle. In the open ocean, where water temperatures can vary considerably between the tropical surface and the depths, and between the tropics and the polar regions, thermoregulation becomes a critical challenge for any large air-breathing vertebrate. The whales of our world solved this problem with a suite of adaptations: thick layers of blubber for insulation, a counter-current heat exchange system in the blood vessels of the flippers that recovers heat from blood flowing toward the cool extremities before it can escape to the water, and in some species, a genuine endothermy, running a metabolic fire hot enough to maintain a consistent body temperature regardless of the water temperature around them. The Spinosaurid descendants of the alternate world face the same challenge and evolve solutions that are, in some ways, parallel to the cetacean solutions, and in other ways, distinctly their own. Insulation is the first requirement. The original Spinosaurus, like all non-avian dinosaurs, may have had some form of insulating integument, though the evidence for this in the Spinosaurid lineage specifically is limited. The fully aquatic Spinosaurid descendants of the alternate world have evolved substantial insulating layers, in some lineages taking the form of dense subepidermal fat deposits, analogous to cetacean blubber, in others taking more complex forms that reflects the specific evolutionary history of the archosaur integument. Some lineages have retained modified versions of the proto-feathers that were present in many theropod dinosaurs, adapted into a dense, short, water-repelling coat that reduces heat loss to the surrounding water. These modified feather-derived structures are not visible as distinct feathers at the surface. They form a smooth, dense pelage that looks more like the skin of a dolphin or a shark than like the feathered surface of a bird, but their archosaur origin is visible in their microscopic structure. The countercurrent heat exchange systems that the cetaceans evolved in the blood vessels of their flippers are also present in functionally equivalent form in the Spinosaurid descendants that have adapted to cold water environments. The basic principle is simple enough that evolution has discovered it many times independently. When warm blood flows from the body's core toward the cold extremity, it passes through blood vessels that are adjacent to vessels carrying cool blood, returning from the extremity to the core. Heat transfers from the warm outgoing blood to the cool returning blood, so that by the time the outgoing blood reaches the extremity, it has already lost much of its heat, and by the time the returning blood reaches the core, it has recovered much of the heat it would otherwise have lost. The extremity runs cool, reducing the heat gradient between it and the surrounding water, and therefore reducing heat loss. The core stays warm. It is elegant engineering, evolved independently in cetaceans, in penguins, in seals, and in various other aquatic homeotherms in our world, and evolved again in the cold-adapted Spinosaurid lineages of the alternate world's polar seas. The polar seas of the alternate world are among the most interesting environments for the Spinosaurid lineages, because they are also among the most challenging. The cold waters of the high latitudes, both Arctic and Antarctic, are extraordinarily productive in the seasons when sunlight returns after the long polar winter, because the cold water holds more dissolved oxygen and more nutrients than warm water, and because the summer bloom of phytoplankton that the returning light triggers is one of the most intense episodes of biological productivity on Earth. The polar seas have always attracted large predators during the productive season, and in the alternate world, Spinosaurid descendants are among those predators. Cold-adapted lineages that evolved in the middle latitudes and pushed gradually toward the poles over millions of years, tracking the productive zones that shift with the seasons, eventually establishing themselves as year-round polar residents or semi-migratory seasonal visitors, depending on the lineage and the specific thermal tolerance they have evolved. The Antarctic Spinosaurid lineages are, in some ways, the most extreme products of the alternate world's evolutionary history. They live in the coldest, most unforgiving ocean on Earth, an ocean so cold that liquid water itself is barely stable at the surface for much of the year, where ice forms and melts and reforms in seasonal cycles that govern the entire ecology of the region. These are animals that have been shaped by natural selection into something that the original Spinosaurus, basking on a warm Cretaceous mudflat in the sunshine of an African delta, would not have recognized as its own descendant. They are large, insulated, physiologically sophisticated machines for converting the extraordinary productivity of the Antarctic seas into the energy of their own continued existence. They are, in evolutionary terms, the completion of a journey that began in the warm shallows of the Tethys and ended, after 66 million years of uninterrupted selection, in the cold and the dark and the productive richness of the southern polar ocean. They have been shaped into this by nothing more than time and pressure and the inexorable logic of selection. No force guided them there. No direction was built into the universe that said a dinosaur should become a polar ocean predator. It is simply what happened when a lineage with certain starting characteristics was placed under certain selective pressures for a certain length of time. The raw material was the Cretaceous Spinosaurid body plan. The selective pressure was the ocean. The time was 66 million years. The result is something that could not have been predicted in detail from the starting conditions, but that is fully explicable in retrospect, once you understand the mechanisms that produced it. The specific ecology of the Chem-Chem beds tells us something important about why the aquatic transition was so available to Spinosaurus, and not to the other large predators sharing its world. The Chem-Chem was, by any measure, one of the most dangerous and prey-rich aquatic environments in the history of life on Earth. Besides Spinosaurus itself, the Chem-Chem fauna included Carcharodontosaurus saharicus, a massive land predator with enormous blade-like teeth, comparable in size to Tyrannosaurus rex. It included Deltadromeus, a long-limbed cursorial theropod. It included enormous sauropod dinosaurs and large ornithopods. The predator-to-prey ratio in this Cretaceous delta system appears to modern eyes almost absurdly skewed toward predation. How did so many large predators coexist in one ecosystem? The answer almost certainly lies in niche partitioning. The terrestrial predators like Carcharodontosaurus hunted the large herbivorous dinosaurs of the land and the floodplain margin. Spinosaurus hunted the extraordinary fish of the river channels and the coastal waters. The niches did not overlap enough for direct competition to be decisive, and the aquatic niche that Spinosaurus occupied was rich enough, and large enough, and full enough of prey to sustain an animal of extraordinary size. The fish did the work. The river delta did the work. The productivity of a major river system draining into a warm, shallow sea in a world where the temperatures were higher and the photosynthetic productivity correspondingly greater was sufficient to support the largest predatory dinosaur we know of, and to do so through the specific mechanism of fish predation, rather than the pursuit of large terrestrial herbivores. This ecological specificity, the dependence on a prey base that was aquatic rather than terrestrial, is precisely what positioned Spinosaurus for the aquatic transition that its body plan was already undergoing. You cannot gradually transition to aquatic life if you are simultaneously dependent on terrestrial prey that requires terrestrial hunting capabilities to catch. But Spinosaurus had already made the dietary transition. It was already feeding primarily from the water. The next steps: the deeper commitment of the body to aquatic locomotion, the further reduction of the hind limbs, the development of the tail as a primary propulsive organ, all of these were downstream of the dietary commitment that had already been made. The diet led the body plan, and given more time, the body plan would have followed the diet all the way into the sea. There is a specific place in the alternate world's Atlantic that deserves its own careful attention, because it is the place where the Spinosaurid story intersects most dramatically with the story of the ocean itself. That place is the deep cold water upwelling zone off the western coast of what is, in our world, southern Africa and Namibia, where the Benguela Current drives nutrient-rich water from the deep ocean to the surface, creating one of the most productive marine ecosystems anywhere on Earth. In our world, this system supports extraordinary concentrations of seabirds and Cape fur seals and African penguins and great white sharks, all converging on the dense fish populations that the upwelling sustains. In the alternate world, the same oceanographic system exists, because the Benguela Current is driven by the rotation of the Earth and the configuration of the continents and the temperature gradient between the equator and the poles, none of which are affected by which creatures happen to be swimming in the water above. The upwelling is there, the fish are there, and in the alternate world, the thing at the top of the food web in this region is not the great white shark. It is a Spinosaurid descendant, a temperate water coastal specialist of perhaps 8 to 10 meters in length, agile and fast, and deeply adapted to the pursuit of the dense schools of small, fast pelagic fish that the Benguela system produces in such staggering quantities. This alternate Benguela lineage is one of the most specialized of all the Spinosaurid coastal forms. Unlike the open ocean giants of the tropical Atlantic, this is not an animal built for the pursuit of large individual prey across vast distances. It is built for high-speed pursuit of dense schooling fish, a predation strategy that rewards agility and acceleration and the ability to turn quickly within the confines of a bait ball. That compressed sphere of panicked fish that forms when a school is surrounded on all sides by predators, and there is nowhere left to go. The alternate Benguela Spinosaurid hunts bait balls in the same way that dolphins and tuna and gannets hunt them in our world, with rushes from below and from the sides and from above, each rush scooping dozens of fish into those long, conical-toothed jaws before the school can scatter. It is a high-energy strategy, burning enormous quantities of metabolic fuel, and it demands that the hunting ground be consistently rich enough to sustain it. The Benguela upwelling is that kind of ground, and the alternate lineage of Spinosaurids that evolved to exploit it has been shaped by millions of years of selection into exactly the right tool for the job. Its skeleton is lighter than those of the open ocean giants, with bones that are dense enough to maintain neutral buoyancy at the shallow depths where the bait ball hunting happens, but not so heavy as to impede the quick directional changes that the hunting strategy requires. Its musculature is organized for power and acceleration rather than sustained speed cruising, giving it the ability to launch explosive bursts of speed from a nearly stationary position. The kind of acceleration that is devastating when deployed against a tight school of fish that has nowhere to retreat to. Its vision is acute and capable of rapid adjustment between looking into the bright surface light and looking toward the darker water below, giving it the ability to use both the visual cues of the sunlit surface layer and the silhouette cues of prey seen against the brighter water above. The descendants of this Benguela lineage spread northward along the African coast and southward into the circumpolar waters that ring Antarctica, colonizing the productive coastal upwelling zones wherever the temperature and prey base are suitable. They are, in their own way, the alternate world's version of the orca, not in body plan but in ecological function, filling the role of the highly mobile, highly specialized, coastal water pursuit predator that organizes the ecology of the productive coastal zones around its hunting behavior. The open ocean is not only organized by the Spinosaurid predators themselves, it is also organized by what they do not eat, by the prey that escapes their attention and thereby proliferates, by the ecological spaces that their predation creates and maintains. A particularly interesting example involves the giant ammonites of the alternate world's tropical Atlantic, those large, fast-swimming coiled cephalopods that have been under Spinosaurid predation pressure for 66 million years, and that have, in response to that pressure, evolved in directions that make them among the most cognitively complex invertebrates in the alternate world's ocean. Cephalopods in our world are already remarkable for the intelligence they have achieved through a completely different evolutionary pathway than the vertebrate brain. The octopus, with its distributed nervous system and its problem-solving capabilities and its extraordinary manipulative dexterity, is one of the clearest demonstrations that intelligence is not a uniquely vertebrate property. The cuttlefish, with its rapid color-changing ability and its complex communication displays, and the squid, with its social behavior and its active schooling strategies, all demonstrate that the cephalopod lineage has found its own path toward cognitive complexity. In the alternate world, where the ammonites have survived and have been under sustained predation pressure from a large, intelligent, visually acute predator for tens of millions of years, the selective pressure for ammonite cognitive development is considerably stronger than anything the cephalopods of our world have experienced. The result is an ammonite lineage that is, in the large open ocean forms, significantly more cognitively capable than any ammonite in the Cretaceous fossil record, significantly more capable of rapid behavioral adjustment in response to threat, of coordinating movement with conspecifics, of learning from experience. Whether this reaches anything that a biologist would be comfortable calling intelligence is a question that the alternate world does not yet need to answer in our terms. What it reaches is a behavioral flexibility and a social complexity that makes the large alternate ammonites challenging prey more challenging than any fish of equivalent size, because the ammonites' response to the approach of a spinosaurid predator is not merely to flee in a straight line at maximum speed. It is to engage in evasive maneuvers that are partly instinctive and partly learned, partly individual, and partly coordinated with other members of the school in the way that a murmuration of starlings in our world coordinates the collective response of many individuals to a predator threat. This social anti-predator behavior, the alternation complex and shifting group movements that make it difficult for a predator to isolate an individual target, is a direct evolutionary response to the Spinosaurid hunting strategy. And it in turn drives the evolution of more sophisticated hunting behavior in the Spinosaurids. And the arms race continues, as arms races always do, with both participants becoming more capable in the process. The ocean of the alternate world is, in this way, characterized by a general trend toward increasing cognitive complexity that operates across the food web rather than being concentrated in a single lineage. The Spinosaurid predators become more cognitively capable because the prey is becoming harder to catch. The prey becomes more cognitively capable because the predators are becoming more effective. The secondary predators, those filling the niches between the apex Spinosaurids and the primary consumers, also experience this pressure, because they are both predator and prey simultaneously, needing to be smart enough to catch their own prey and smart enough to avoid being caught by the animals above them in the food web. The ocean becomes, over tens of millions of years, a more cognitively complex place than the ocean of the Cretaceous was, not because any single evolutionary event pushed it in that direction, but because the sustained selective pressure of a complex predator-prey system operating over geological time rewards cognitive investment in every species that participates in it. This is one of the most interesting and most speculative dimensions of the alternate world we have been constructing. The idea that sustained, complex predator-prey interactions over very long time spans drive general increases in cognitive complexity across the ecosystem is not merely speculation. It has theoretical support in the Red Queen hypothesis. The idea that co-evolutionary arms races between predators and prey drive continuous evolutionary change in both parties. And it has empirical support in the observation that the most cognitively complex marine predators in our world, the cetaceans and the large sharks and the cephalopods, are all products of complex, sustained predator-prey interactions over tens of millions of years. The alternate world simply extends this principle to a new apex predator and a new set of prey lineages, and follows the logic of the Red Queen wherever it leads. Where it leads, over 66 million years of uninterrupted operation, is to an ocean that is not only ecologically complex, but cognitively complex, in a way that our ocean, extraordinary as it is, may not quite match. The alternate ocean's apex predators, the open ocean Spinosaurid giants of the tropical Atlantic, and the Pacific, and the Indian Ocean, are not simple stimulus response machines. They are animals with histories, with learned knowledge of specific hunting grounds and migration routes and prey behaviors, with social structures that transmit information across generations. The young learn from the adults. The adults learn from experience. The information that accumulates in a population over many generations. The knowledge of where the prey congregates in what season, of how to hunt in deep water versus shallow water, of what the acoustic signatures of different prey species sound like, so that they can be identified at long range. This accumulated knowledge is itself a form of cultural inheritance, not genetic, but behavioral, transmitted through observation and imitation and practice, rather than through the copying of DNA. This kind of behavioral cultural transmission is present in our world's cetaceans. Orca populations have dialects, distinct acoustic traditions that differ between populations, and that are learned rather than innate. Humpback whale songs change over time in ways that suggest social transmission of new vocal elements between individuals. Bottlenose dolphins in Shark Bay, Australia, use sponges as tools to protect their rostrums while foraging in sandy substrate. And if you like the video so far, please leave us a like and a sub. A sub to the channel helps us make more videos for you to watch and keep the channel alive. And this behavior is transmitted from mother to offspring across multiple generations. These are small but genuine examples of culture in the ocean, of information that lives not in the genome, but in the behaviors of individual animals and the social networks that connect them. In the alternate world, with 66 million years of sustained cognitive evolution under complex predator-prey pressure, the cultural transmission in the Spinosaurid lineages has had far more time to develop and to produce far more complex behavioral traditions. The hunting strategies, the migration routes, the breeding ground locations, the prey identification techniques, all of these are partially cultural, partially learned rather than wholly innate, and the social structures that sustain this cultural transmission are correspondingly elaborate. None of this makes the alternate world Spinosaurids conscious in the way that humans are conscious. None of it implies self-awareness or abstract reasoning or language in any of the senses that those words carry when applied to human cognition. But it does suggest a form of mind that is considerably more developed than we would naively expect from a lineage that was, 100 million years ago, fishing the channels of a Cretaceous delta with a brain not obviously larger relative to body size than that of a crocodile. 66 million years of cognitive selection under complex predatory circumstances, acting on a lineage that already had the relatively large theropod brain as its starting point, that already had the social structures that many theropod lineages seem to have possessed, and that was already in the process of expanding into an environment that rewards complex sensory processing and flexible behavioral adjustment, produces something interesting. We cannot say exactly how interesting. The alternate world has not yet produced a species capable of administering a cognitive test to a Spinosaurid descendant, but the logic of the selective pressures involved suggests that the alternate world's apex marine predators are among the more cognitively capable animals that the planet has ever produced. Let us return for a moment to the place where the story began, the Kem beds of Morocco and Algeria, that ancient delta system where the actual Spinosaurus lived and died and left its bones in the rock, are still there in the alternate world. The rock is the same rock, deposited in the same way, by the same rivers, draining into the same sea. But the coastline above those rocks, the coastline of the alternate world's North Africa, which in our world would be the Sahara, in the alternate world is something very different. Because without the end Cretaceous extinction and the dramatic changes in global climate that followed it, the world's climate in the alternate timeline has evolved along a different path. The Sahara of our world was created partly by the reorganization of global atmospheric circulation patterns that followed the Cretaceous extinction and the subsequent evolutionary history of the planet's vegetation and its relationship to climate. In the alternate world, those patterns evolved differently. The great North African river systems that drained into the ancient Tethys may have persisted in modified form, fed by the continued monsoon-like circulation of a warmer world. producing a landscape that is not the barren desert of our North Africa, but something more like the ancient savanna that the geological record tells us was present in the Sahara as recently as 11,000 years ago in our world, green and complex and rich with life. Along the coastline of this alternate North Africa, where the Spinosaurid descendants of the original Spinosaurus haul out on beaches and mudflats in the early morning, where the ancient rivers still carry sediment to the sea in their seasonal floods, where the alternation of wet and dry seasons produces the pulsing rhythm of ecological productivity that has sustained life in this region for hundreds of millions of years. There is a richness that has no equivalent in the North Africa we know. The large terrestrial dinosaurs that still roam this alternate world move through the same landscape that their Cretaceous ancestors inhabited, modified by 66 million years of continued evolution, producing new species and new body plans and new ecological relationships, but still organized around the fundamental dynamics of large herbivore and large predator, and the vegetation that sustains both. And at the edge of this world, at the margin where the land meets the sea that the Spinosaurid dynasty has made its own, there is a threshold that is, in the alternate world, one of the most ecologically charged and biologically rich places on Earth. The intertidal zone, that strip of habitat that is alternately land and sea with every tide, is in any world a place of extraordinary ecological complexity. In our world, it supports communities of organisms, from barnacles and mussels and sea anemones to shore crabs and shorebirds, and the various mammals and fish that exploit the resources of the zone, that are organized around the specific challenges and opportunities of an environment that is constantly alternating between aerial and aquatic conditions. In the alternate world, this zone is organized around an additional and very unusual challenge: the possibility of encountering a Spinosaurid descendant that has hauled out from the sea, or is in the process of hauling out, or is hunting in the shallow water just beyond the edge of the zone. The organisms that have survived and thrived in the intertidal zone of this alternate world are, without exception, ones that have found successful responses to this additional predation pressure. Those responses are varied. Some are morphological: thicker shells, deeper burrows, cryptic coloration that makes detection harder. Some are behavioral, activity patterns timed to the known rhythms of Spinosaurid haul-out behavior, avoidance of the specific areas of beach most commonly used by the large animals, flight responses triggered at greater distances. Some are ecological, the organization of entire communities around the presence of the large predators in ways that produce unexpected trophic structures, with middle-level predators suppressed in the areas of greatest Spinosaurid activity and proliferating in the refugia that the large predators do not visit. The result is an intertidal zone that is, in some ways, richer and more complex than the intertidal zones of our world, because the additional predation pressure from above and from the sea simultaneously has driven a more elaborate suite of adaptations in the organisms that persist there. And that complexity radiates outward into the adjacent environments, into the shallow subtidal zone, and into the terrestrial edge habitat above the high tide line, producing a gradient of ecological complexity that is a direct product of the Spinosaurid presence. This is, ultimately, what apex predators do to ecosystems. They do not simply consume, they organize. They create the selective pressures that shape the entire biological community around them. The presence of a large, mobile, partially terrestrial predator in the coastal zone of the alternate world's ocean has organized 66 million years of coastal evolution around the fact of its existence. Every organism that lives in that zone today, in the alternate world's timeline, carries in its body plan or its behavior or its life history some signature of that organizing pressure, some adaptation that is a response to the challenge that the Spinosaurid descendants pose. They are shaped by the predator even if they have never been eaten by one, even if they belong to a lineage that the predator never directly preys upon, because the indirect effects of apex predation, the cascades and the competition and the release of some species when others are suppressed, reach everywhere in an ecosystem. There is a particular kind of scientific detective story that led us to understand what Spinosaurus actually was, and it is worth telling because the story of how we came to know the animal is inseparable from the story of the animal itself. The history of Spinosaurus in science begins in 1912, when a German paleontologist named Ernst Stromer von Reichenbach led an expedition to the Bahariya Oasis in the Egyptian desert, in the western reaches of what is now Egypt. Stromer was a methodical and careful scientist working in the tradition of German natural philosophy, and what he found in the desert rock of the Bahariya Formation was extraordinary. Bones of an enormous theropod, unlike anything that had been found before, with vertebrae bearing neural spines of startling length, some of them nearly 2 meters tall, rising from the backbone in a series that would, if covered in skin or muscle, have produced a distinctive sail or crest along the animal's back. Stromer brought the material back to Munich, to the Bavarian State Collection for Paleontology, and there he described and named it Spinosaurus aegyptiacus, the spine lizard of Egypt. The original material was destroyed in 1944 when Allied bombing of Munich during the Second World War hit the museum and the collections were lost. Photographs and drawings and Stromer's careful written descriptions survived, but the bones themselves were gone, reducing what had been the primary source of information about one of the largest predatory dinosaurs ever found to a set of secondary records. For decades after the war, Spinosaurus remained a poorly known ghost, a creature reconstructed largely from the records of material that no longer existed, and from fragmentary additional finds that slowly accumulated in the scientific literature. It was generally assumed to be a large, terrestrial theropod, walking upright like a tyrannosaur, hunting large prey on land, the sail on its back perhaps serving as a thermoregulatory organ or a display structure. This picture began to change as more material was found, and as the science of paleoecology and biomechanical analysis became more sophisticated. In the 1990s, partial skulls and other material from the chem beds of Morocco began to accumulate, and the conical teeth and the crocodile-like shape of the snout became clearer. Researchers began to recognize that a snout shaped like that, with teeth like those, in an ecological context like the chem, which preserved enormous amounts of large fish material alongside the spinosaurid bones, pointed strongly toward a fish-eating lifestyle. Comparisons with modern fish-eating crocodilians, with the gharial of the Indian subcontinent and the false gharial of Southeast Asia, both of which have that same narrow, rounded, conical-toothed snout profile, strengthened the inference. Spinosaurus was probably a fisher, a very large fisher in a world full of very large fish. The transformation of the scientific understanding of Spinosaurus accelerated dramatically in the second decade of this century. A partial skeleton found in the chem beds of Morocco by a team led by Nizar Ibrahim, an American-German paleontologist at the University of Detroit Mercy, provided material that allowed a much more complete reconstruction of the animal's body proportions. Ibrahim and his colleagues, including the Chicago paleontologist Paul Serino and a team of international collaborators, published their analysis in the journal Science in 2014. The results were startling. Spinosaurus had hind limbs that were dramatically shorter, relative to its body length, than those of any other large theropod known. Its center of mass was positioned much further forward than in a bipedal terrestrial theropod. Its feet were broad and its toes were connected by the soft tissue, suggesting a webbed or paddle-like structure. Everything about the proportions pointed away from a terrestrial animal and towards something semi-aquatic at minimum. A subsequent study, published in 2020 by the same lead team, added a crucial new piece of evidence. New tail material from the same Moroccan locality showed that the neural spines of the tail in Spinosaurus were elongated and laterally flattened in a way that was quite different from the tall, narrow sail spines of the back. The tail spines were shaped more like the spines in a fish's tail fin, broad and blade-like in cross-section, connected to each other by a web of skin and soft tissue. Analysis of the tail's geometry and the likely muscle attachments suggested strongly that this was a propulsive organ, a sculling tail that would have moved laterally through the water to generate thrust in the way that a crocodile's tail does, though with a surface area and a power output scaled to an animal that was considerably larger than any living crocodilian. The publication of this finding in the journal Nature generated considerable discussion in the scientific community, with some researchers accepting the aquatic interpretation enthusiastically, and others raising questions about specific aspects of the reconstruction. But the broad direction of the evidence was clear to most observers. Spinosaurus was not just a wading fisher, it was a genuine swimmer, capable of sustained locomotion in the water column. This is where the science stands today. Not completely settled, not without debate at the margins of the interpretation, but pointing clearly in a direction that no one anticipated when Ernst Stromer first brought the bones out of the Egyptian desert more than a century ago. The direction is the water, and knowing that direction is what makes the alternate world we have explored tonight feel like more than mere fantasy. It is extrapolation from evidence. It is following the arrow that the bones are already pointing, across the gap of 66 million years, to see where it would have eventually arrived if the world had given it time. The researchers who work on Spinosaurus, Ibrahim and Sereno, and their colleagues and the other paleontologists around the world who study the Spinosaurid lineage, are engaged in exactly this kind of extrapolation, though they would be careful to distinguish between what the evidence directly supports and what it suggests as possibility. They examine the bones with every available technique, CT scanning to reveal internal bone structure, analysis of bone histology to understand growth rates and metabolic rates, computational biomechanical modeling to test hypotheses about locomotion, isotopic analysis to infer diet and habitat preferences. Each technique adds a layer to the picture, refines the reconstruction, makes the animal more real and more specific. This is patient work. It takes years to excavate a major Spinosaurid site carefully and safely, to jacket the bones in plaster in the field and transport them to a laboratory, to clean them with dental tools and air scribes under magnification, to scan them and measure them and compare them with other material. It takes years more to analyze the data and write up the results, and submit them for peer review and revise in response to criticism, and eventually see the work published. The pace of paleontological discovery is geological in a different sense. Slow and methodical and cumulative, each finding adding a small piece to a large picture that is always more complete than it was a generation ago, and always less complete than it will be a generation from now. This is worth holding in mind as you settle into the end of this night. What we know about Spinosaurus is not fixed. It will grow. The chem-chem beds are not exhausted. The formations of Spain and Portugal and England and Brazil, all of which have yielded Spinosaurid material, have more to give. Future expeditions, future excavations, future analyses of material already in museum collections using techniques not yet developed, all of these will add to the picture. The Spinosaurus of scientific understanding in 30 years will be more complete, more precise, more surprising than the Spinosaurus of today. The alternate world we have imagined tonight is built on the Spinosaurus we know now, in the year we are in, with the evidence available to us at this moment. Future evidence may suggest that the alternate world should be imagined somewhat differently, that the starting point of the aquatic transition was further along than we currently think, or that the specific anatomical features we used as the basis for our extrapolation were slightly different from what we have reconstructed. The science is always a work in progress. What does not change is the wonder. The animal was real. It lived in a real world, ate real fish, moved through real water, left real bones in rock that is still accessible to anyone with a permit, and the patience to work carefully in a North African desert. The fact that it was in the middle of becoming something, that the evolutionary arrow was pointing toward the ocean and had not yet completed its journey, is not a disappointment. It is part of what makes the animal fascinating. Spinosaurus is not a completed thing that we can simply catalogue and file. It is a process, caught in motion, preserved in rock at a single moment in the middle of a transformation that was still unfolding. Looking at it is like looking at a photograph of a river in the moment of flooding. The water caught in mid-surge, neither at its ordinary level nor at its peak, but in the dynamic middle of becoming something different. The photograph tells you where the water came from and hints at where it is going. The bones of Spinosaurus tell you where the lineage came from and hint at where it was going. Where it was going was the sea, and in tonight's imagining, we followed it there. Now, let us think about one more dimension of this world that we have built together tonight, because it is perhaps the most philosophically interesting question of all. What happens to intelligence in a world where the ocean is dominated by a Spinosaurid dynasty and the land is still organized around the non-avian dinosaurs? In our world, the end Cretaceous extinction cleared the ecological space that eventually allowed the primates to diversify and produce, after tens of millions of years of further evolution, the lineage that eventually became us. We are, in the deepest sense, beneficiaries of the asteroid. Our existence, and the existence of every other large-brained mammal on Earth, depends on that catastrophe. Without the extinction event, without the clearing of the non-avian dinosaurs, and the subsequent radiation of the mammals into the vacated niches, there is no ecological space for a large-brained, social, bipedal primate to evolve. This does not mean that intelligence does not evolve in the alternate world. Intelligence, the capacity for flexible problem-solving, and the ability to model the world mentally and to modify behavior in response to novel challenges, is not exclusive to mammals. The crows and parrots and ravens of our world demonstrate that avian intelligence can reach remarkable levels, produced by a completely different brain architecture than the mammalian neocortex. In the alternate world, where the avian dinosaurs continue to diversify in the absence of the extinction event, avian intelligence has 66 million more years to develop. Some lineages of avian dinosaur, the crow-like and parrot-like intelligences of the continued Cretaceous, may have followed their own evolutionary trajectory toward greater cognitive complexity, producing in the alternate world's timeline something that we cannot fully predict, but that might, given sufficient time and the right ecological pressures, have eventually produced something interesting. The non-avian dinosaurs have also produced in our world's fossil record suggestions of social complexity and parental care that hint at cognitive capabilities we tend to underestimate. The hadrosaurs, with their complex crests that may have been used for communication, the troodontids with their relatively large brains and their grasping forelimbs, these animals were not simple brutes. They were complex, behaviorally sophisticated creatures operating in social contexts that required real cognitive investment. Given 66 million more years of evolution, under the right pressures, some lineage of non-avian dinosaur might have developed cognitive complexity of a kind we can only speculate about. But this is, in the end, speculation. What is not speculation? What is rooted in the actual fossil record and the actual biology of Spinosaurus and its known relatives is the rest of what we have discussed tonight. The aquatic adaptations are real. The dense bones, the high nostrils, the laterally flattened tail, the short rear limbs, the conical fish-catching teeth, all of this is real, documented, measured, argued over in the pages of scientific journals by the paleontologists who have spent their careers in the field and in the laboratory making sense of the bones that the chem beds have yielded up. The evolutionary potential of the Spinosaurid body plan for aquatic life is real. The ecological logic of an apex marine predator reorganizing the food web around itself is real, documented in every ocean ecosystem on Earth today. What we have done tonight is take those real things and follow them forward through the filter of genuine evolutionary and ecological principles to see where they might have led if the world had given them more time. The world did not give them more time. That is the other reality, the one we live in, the one whose oceans are organized around the mammals and the sharks and the teleost fish that inherited the sea 66 million years ago. Our oceans are extraordinary. The blue whale, the largest animal that has ever lived on Earth in any form that we know of, a creature that produces sounds so low that other blue whales can hear them from the other side of an ocean basin. A creature whose heart is the size of a small car. A creature that evolved from a small, four-legged terrestrial mammal in less time than Spinosaurus spent honing its aquatic adaptations. The blue whale is one of the most astonishing products of evolutionary history that has ever existed. The orca, the great white shark, the sperm whale diving to 3 kilometers in the dark hunting squid the size of a bus, the humpback whale breaching in the cold surface water of the Southern Ocean with a grace that its enormous mass makes seem impossible. These are the apex predators of our ocean, and they are magnificent. But if you like the video so far, please leave us a like and a sub. A sub to the channel helps us make more videos for you to watch and keep the channel alive. But tonight, in the dark, as you breathe and settle and let the weight of the day release from your body into the surface beneath you, hold this other ocean in your mind for a moment. The one that almost was. The one where Spinosaurus, that magnificent, half-finished experiment in aquatic life, never ran out of time. Where the delta country of the ancient Tethys opened outward into a sea that had room for a dynasty, not just an individual, not just a genus, but 100 million years of descendants carrying forward the genetic logic of those dense bones and those high nostrils and that long, conical, fish-hunting snout, diversifying into every basin and every depth and every ecological niche that the global ocean offered. In that alternate world, the ocean at this moment right now, would belong to something we have no name for. Something that breathes air and sees, with eyes adapted to dim blue water, and swims with a power that no fish can match, and hunts prey that has been co-evolving with it for 66 million years. Something that is, in the deepest sense, still a dinosaur, still carrying in its genome the ancient signatures of the Archosaur lineage, still connected by the unbroken thread of descent to the creatures that ruled the Mesozoic land and sea and sky. Something that represents one of the great roads not taken in the history of life on Earth. Spinosaurus itself, the actual animal, the one whose bones we have found and measured and argued about and reconstructed and revised, was not quite finished with its transformation when the world ended. The Cretaceous closed while the experiment was still running. The asteroid arrived before the full potential of that extraordinary body plan could be realized. What we find in the Chem beds is not a completed thing. It is a creature in the middle of becoming. Dense bones and a high set nose and a flattened tail and reduced hind legs, all pointing in the same direction, all saying the same thing. The water, the water, the water. But the world did not have time to finish the sentence. We are, in a strange way, the inheritors of that incompleteness. The ocean we swim in and sail on and fish in and marvel at is the ocean that existed after Spinosaurus' story was cut short. The whales and dolphins that we find so moving, those great mammals of the sea that we have hunted and studied and tried to protect, they are here partly because Spinosaurus was not given the time it needed. The ecological space that cetacean evolution filled was vacated when the asteroid ended the Spinosaurid line. We benefited from that ending, just as we benefited from every earlier extinction and ecological disruption that cleared the path for the eventual evolution of the mammals, and then the primates, and then the hominins that eventually became us. Extinction is loss, It is real loss, the permanent ending of evolutionary trajectories that had taken millions of years to develop, and that would have continued to develop in ways we can only imagine. But extinction is also clearing. It is the removal of occupants from ecological space that other lineages then fill. Every major extinction in the history of life on Earth was followed by a radiation, an explosion of diversity as surviving lineages expanded into the niches vacated by the ones that disappeared. The end Cretaceous extinction was the greatest such clearing in the last several 100 million years, and the world that emerged from it, our world, with its mammals and its flowering plants and its teleost fish and its great whales, is one of the most biologically complex and productive that Earth has ever known. But the world before that clearing was also extraordinary. Spinosaurus was extraordinary. Whatever it was becoming, whatever the endpoint of that aquatic transformation, would have been given 66 million more years of uninterrupted evolutionary pressure, it would have been extraordinary too. We are the ones who got to survive, and to develop language, and to dig up the bones of Spinosaurus from the rocks of Morocco and Algeria, and to look at those bones and understand what they mean, and to lie in the dark and imagine the world they pointed toward. That capacity for imagination, for reconstructing lost worlds, and following evolutionary roads not taken, is one of the most specifically human things about us. The bones themselves do not imagine. They simply preserve, in the calcium phosphate of mineralized tissue, the evidence of a life lived in a specific time and place. It is we who look at them and see the possibility space behind them, who understand that the dense bone density points to aquatic life, who trace the neural spine morphology and understand that it points toward a structure capable of functioning in water, who see in all of these separate lines of evidence the outlines of a creature that was, at the moment of the Cretaceous' ending, in the middle of becoming something that no terrestrial predator had ever become before. There is a peculiar kind of grief that comes with thinking carefully about the worlds that almost were. Not the grief of personal loss, not the grief of death or separation, but something more diffuse and philosophical. The grief of roads not taken, of experiments cut short, of forms that existed in potential but never got to fully realize that potential. Spinosaurus is one of those forms. It was not finished, and we will never know from the fossil record alone what it would have finished as, because the asteroid intervened before the finishing could happen. What we can do, what paleontology has always done at its best, is use the evidence we have to imagine as carefully and as rigorously as possible what the full range of possibilities might have been. The bones of Spinosaurus tell us the direction. The evolutionary principles we have developed from studying every other lineage that has ever made the terrestrial to aquatic transition tell us something about the mechanisms. The ecological principles we have developed from studying every living ocean ecosystem on Earth tell us something about what an apex marine predator does to the system around it. Put all of that together, and you get something like the alternate world we have been exploring tonight. Imperfect and speculative, but rooted in real science, built on real bones, following real evolutionary logic toward a real possibility that the universe happened not to choose. As you settle deeper now, as the night thickens around you and the sounds of your immediate world grow quieter, and the thoughts of the day recede toward their resting place, carry this with you into sleep. The ocean outside your window, or the ocean you can imagine if you are far from the shore, is a record of choices. Every creature in it is an answer to an evolutionary question, and the question was always the same. What works here, now, in this environment, with these resources, against these competitors and these predators and these prey? Spinosaurus answered that question with dense bones and high nostrils, and a laterally flattened tail and a long snout full of conical teeth. The blue whale answered it with baleen plates and a heart the size of a car and a song that crosses ocean basins. The great white shark answered it with lateral lines that detect pressure waves and an olfactory system that detects a drop of blood in a million drops of water. Each of these answers is a form of astonishing ingenuity. The ingenuity not of a mind, but of time, of selection pressure operating over millions of generations on the raw material of genetic variation. The alternate ocean we have imagined tonight is not a better ocean than the one we have. It is just another ocean, another set of answers to the same eternal question, produced by a slightly different sequence of events in the first few seconds of geological time after the Cretaceous closed. Both oceans are beautiful. Both oceans are complex. Both oceans represent the full creative potential of evolutionary processes operating over vast time spans on the extraordinary diversity of life that this planet has produced. The one we have is the one we are responsible for now. The one whose blue whales we hunted nearly to extinction and whose coral reefs we are bleaching with the heat of our changing atmosphere. The alternate one exists only in the space of careful imagination, sustained by the evidence in the rocks and by the principles of biology that apply in any possible world. Spinosaurus is in the rocks of Morocco, and in the rocks of Egypt, and in the rocks of other formations that may yet yield more of its story. It is there in the ground, patient in the way that only things that have been underground for 95 million years can be patient, waiting for the next excavation, the next careful brush and dental pick and plaster jacket to bring it out of the matrix and into the light, where we can look at it again and revise our understanding of what it was. Every few years, the scientific picture shifts. A new specimen emerges. A new analysis re-examines existing material with new techniques. The reconstruction of Spinosaurus in 2020, led by Nizar Ibrahim and Paul Sereno and their collaborators, changed the scientific consensus about the animal's locomotion substantially, providing new evidence for the tail's function as a propulsive organ, and new evidence for the reduced rear limb function that is so important to the aquatic hypothesis. Future discoveries will shift the picture again. That is how the science works. That is how we get closer, never perfectly close, but closer to what Spinosaurus actually was. What we are certain of is that it was extraordinary. The largest predatory dinosaur we know of. Possibly the most specialized of all the large theropods for aquatic life. A creature that pushes the boundaries of what we thought we knew about the range of ecological strategies available to the dinosaur body plan. A creature that was, at the moment of its ending, pointing toward an ocean that would have been very different from the one we inherited. You are warm now, or nearly so. The weight of your body is settling. The breath is slower than it was when this story began. Somewhere beneath you, beneath the floors and the foundation and the soil and the bedrock, are rocks that preserve the history of this planet in their layered strata, and in some of those layers, in the right formation in the right part of the world, there are the mineralized remains of creatures that were doing things that no creature had ever done before, and that no creature has done since. They were not finished. They were in the middle of becoming. And the world that would have resulted from their completion exists now only as a thought, held gently in the mind of anyone willing to sit with the evidence and follow it forward with patience and imagination, and a genuine feeling of wonder at how strange and various and inventive life on this planet has been and continues to be. The ocean tonight is dark and deep and moving. It always is in every world, in every version of the timeline. The water does not care about the particular creatures that surface in it to breathe. It was here before Spinosaurus, and it was here before the blue whale, and it will be here after everything we know has changed into something we cannot yet imagine. The water just moves. The currents circle the planet at their geological pace. The nutrients rise from the deep in their cold columns, and the surface blooms, and the things that eat the bloom are eaten in turn, and the chain runs upward to whatever is waiting at the top. Patient and enormous, and adapted to exactly this. Sleep now. Let the alternate ocean recede. Let the real one remain, moving beneath you in the dark, carrying in its depths the actual answers to the question that Spinosaurus was only beginning to answer when the sky changed everything. Those answers are there, in the blue whale and the orca and the shark, in the 10 million species of marine organism that have filled the space the dinosaurs vacated. They are extraordinary answers. And the world that produced them, the world we live in, the world whose oceans we are only beginning to truly understand, is as worthy of wonder as any world we might imagine in the dark. Good night. The water is deep, and the old bones are still in the rock, and somewhere in the Atlantic tonight, something enormous is surfacing to breathe. Where in the world are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe if you want to see more videos like this. See you on the next one.